I'm giving you one last chance. Come back now, and I'll forget everything." His voice was cold, unyielding, and confident, but I was far from convinced. What was he even talking about? For months, he had treated me like I was invisible, and now he suddenly wanted to act like everything was fine? Number. He needed to face the truth. We were no longer the same. My name is Olivia. I'm 32 years old, and I've been married to Mason for just over a year. We met at a casual party hosted by a mutual friend, and things quickly escalated from there. It wasn't some whirlwind romance filled with passion and excitement. In fact, it was the opposite. Our relationship was calm, almost too calm. But at the time, that's exactly what I wanted. Peace. Mason wasn't the most exciting man, but he brought a sense of stability, a certain quietness that I thought would last us a lifetime. After all, we weren't getting any younger, and settling down seemed like the practical choice. He had a good job, and I did too. We weren't rich, but we wouldn't go hungry. Our relationship on paper was perfect. But real life isn't like paper. It has weight, tension, cracks that begin to form beneath the surface when no one's watching. From the beginning, I handled most of the housework. Mason would leave for work early and return late, usually tired from his long day. He never offered to help, but it never bothered me. My parents lived like this too. I figured this was just how marriage worked. I would cook, clean, and keep the house running while Mason focused on his career. Besides, I had a steady 9-to-5 job and wasn't overloaded with hobbies. It wasn't hard to manage the house on my own. But soon, I started to realize something was off. We weren't the type of couple to talk endlessly about our days. We both valued our space, and in the beginning, that worked. But as time passed, the silence between us grew heavier. There was no longer any laughter, no casual conversations, just a quiet that seemed to fill every corner of our home. I ignored it at first, convincing myself that we were just going through a phase. But the phase didn't end. It only deepened. One night, Mason came home late, much later than usual. I had prepared dinner, as always, and waited for him to come back from whatever after-work drinks he had been at. When he finally walked through the door, I greeted him. "Mason, you're home late. Dinner's still on the table if you're hungry." He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. Without a word, he went straight into the living room and collapsed on the couch, staring blankly at the television. I sighed. This wasn't the first time Mason had come home in a bad mood. Whenever something upset him, he would shut down completely. Over the past year, I had learned not to poke the bear when he was like this. It was easier to let him simmer in silence until he calmed down. I headed to bed alone that night, feeling his presence lingering in the living room. I figured by morning, things would go back to normal, like they always did. But this time, they didn't. The next morning, I greeted him cheerfully, hoping the night had washed away whatever had been bothering him. "Good morning, Mason," I said as I placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table. He glanced at me, his face still emotionless, and without saying a word, grabbed his coffee and left the room. I stood there, confused. His coldness wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Still, I brushed it off, telling myself that he'd come around eventually. But the silence stretched into days. Days turned into weeks. And then it hit me. Mason wasn't just in a bad mood. He was deliberately ignoring me. At first, I thought I must have done something wrong. Maybe I had said something or forgotten something important. But as the days passed and his silence continued, I realized it wasn't about anything I had done. I tried reaching out. I sent messages on WhatsApp, left little notes for him, asking if everything was all right. But he ignored all of it. He'd take the lunch I packed for him, and when I'd check the sink after work, I'd find his lunchbox empty. So he was eating what I made him. He was still physically there. But emotionally, he was gone. It was like living with a ghost. After nearly a month of this, I couldn't take it anymore. Something had to give. One evening, I decided to try something different. I didn't make dinner. For as long as we'd been married, I had always cooked dinner every evening. But tonight, I left the kitchen empty and sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV as I waited for Mason to come home. When he finally walked through the door, I felt my heart racing. Would he notice? Would he say something? He stepped into the living room, glanced at the dining table where dinner usually sat, and froze. His eyes lingered on the empty table before they drifted toward me. I held my breath, waiting for him to speak. But he didn't. Without a word, he turned and walked back out the door. I heard it slam behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house. My chest tightened. Why was this happening? Why was I being punished with silence? The next morning, Mason was already gone by the time I woke up. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets barely disturbed. I walked into the living room, hoping to find some clue as to where he had gone. And that's when I saw it. A note, hastily scribbled and left on the table. "Stop skipping out on your wifely duties." My hands trembled as I read those words. Something inside me snapped. Wifely duties? Was that all I was to him? Someone to cook his meals and clean his house? I had tried to be patient, to understand him. But this was too much. I was done trying to fix whatever was broken between us. Without another word, I packed my bags and left. I went back to my parents' house, my mind spinning with confusion and anger. When I told them what had happened, they were surprisingly supportive. They welcomed me back without question, understanding that I needed time to figure things out. Days passed, and then weeks. I heard nothing from Mason. No phone calls, no messages, not even a visit. It was as if he had simply erased me from his life. And in a way, I was relieved. If he didn't care enough to reach out, why should I? Months went by, and I started to rebuild my life. I reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work, and slowly began to feel like myself again. I had almost forgotten about Mason entirely, until one day, I came face to face with him. I was leaving my parents' house, heading out for a quick trip to the store when I saw him. Mason was standing in the driveway, his arms crossed, an angry scowl on his face. My heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here after all this time? I froze, unsure of what to do. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us speaking. And then, without warning, Mason tried to push past me, heading straight for my parents' front door. "Wait," I said, stepping in front of him. "You can't just barge in like that." He stopped, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. "Since when do you get to tell me what to do?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "You can't just walk into my parents' house without permission." He glared at me, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might explode. But then, to my surprise, he let out a bitter laugh. "Look at you," he sneered. "Acting all high and mighty just because you're staying with your parents. Who do you think you are?" I had never seen Mason like this before. Sure, he had always been a bit distant, but this was something else entirely. It was like he had become a different person, someone filled with resentment and anger. "You left the house for half a year," he continued, his voice rising. "And now you think you can just live it up with your parents like nothing ever happened?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was acting as if I had abandoned him, as if I had been the one ignoring him for months. His accusations stung, but I knew I couldn't let him control the narrative, not anymore. "Listen," I said firmly. "We're not together anymore. I'm not coming back." Mason's face turned red with rage. "What the hell are you talking about? We're married. You can't just walk away." "I've already filed for divorce," I replied quietly. "We're strangers now, Mason." The words seemed to hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he stood there, stunned into silence. Then, just as quickly, the anger returned. "You've lost your mind," he spat. "You think you can just end this? You'll regret it." But I didn't feel regret. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Mason stood there, his face twisting with disbelief. "Divorce? You think you can just divorce me and be done with it?" His voice grew louder, and I could feel the tension building. "You've got no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied firmly, trying to keep my composure. "I've filed for divorce, and it's already been processed. We are no longer married." For a moment, Mason was speechless. He blinked as if trying to process my words. Then suddenly, a sarcastic smile crept across his face. You really think you're going to be better off without me? At your age, who's going to want you? His words hit me like a slap, but I didn't let them show. He was trying to hurt me, to control me with his words, just like he had with his silence for all those months. But this time, it wouldn't work. That's not your concern anymore, Mason. We're strangers now. Mason's face flushed red with fury. He began pacing in front of me, his fists clenching and unclenching. This is ridiculous. You're being irrational. You think running back to your parents and filing some papers makes you free? That's not how this works, Olivia. You're my wife, and you're coming home with me. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said, my voice calm but firm. This is over. Suddenly, Mason lunged toward me, grabbing my arm tightly. You're coming with me now, he growled, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and anger. Stop this nonsense. I yanked my arm free, stepping back from him. Let go of me. My voice was louder than I intended, but I didn't care. I had had enough. Mason glared at me, his face twisted with anger. You don't get to just walk away from this, he hissed. You'll regret it. Just then, the front door of my parents' house opened, and my father stepped out, his face filled with concern. Is everything all right out here? He asked, his eyes darting between Mason and me. Mason's expression faltered for a moment, but then he straightened up, trying to regain his composure. We're just talking, he said, his voice tight. I looked at my father and shook my head. No, we're not. Mason was just leaving. My father stepped closer, his presence a silent warning to Mason. I think it's time for you to go, Mason. Mason's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't say anything. He knew he was outnumbered. With a final glare in my direction, he turned and stormed off, muttering under his breath. As I watched him leave, a weight lifted off my chest. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. It was over. Really over. The days that followed were a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt lighter, freer than I had in years. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that Mason had left behind. I had no idea what he would do next, but I knew I couldn't let it control my life anymore. I decided to stay with my parents for a while, to give myself some time to heal and figure out what my next steps would be. They were incredibly supportive, giving me the space I needed while also reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. Weeks passed, and gradually, I started to rebuild my life. I reconnected with old friends, started going out more, and even picked up a new hobby, painting. It was something I had always wanted to do, but never seemed to have the time for. Now, I was making time for myself, and it felt good. During this period of self-discovery, I also met Noah. He was a colleague from work, someone I had always been friendly with but never really thought of in a romantic way. But after my divorce, things began to change. Noah was kind, supportive, and always seemed to know just what to say to make me smile. He wasn't like Mason. He wasn't distant or cold. Instead, he was warm, attentive, and genuinely interested in me as a person. At first, I was hesitant to get involved with anyone so soon after my divorce. But Noah was patient. He didn't push, didn't rush me into anything. We started out as friends, spending time together after work, sharing coffee breaks, and talking about everything from our favorite books to our dreams for the future. Slowly, I found myself falling for him. He made me feel things I hadn't felt in years: excitement, joy, and most importantly, a sense of peace. With him, I didn't feel like I had to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I could just be me. Just as my life was starting to fall into place again, Mason reappeared. It had been months since our confrontation at my parents' house, and I had heard nothing from him. No calls, no messages, nothing. I had assumed he had finally moved on, but I was wrong. It was a Friday evening, and I was getting ready to meet Noah for dinner when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to find Mason standing there, his face twisted with anger. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to talk," Mason said, pushing his way inside before I could stop him. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, stepping back. "We're divorced, Mason. This is over." Mason's eyes narrowed. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just walk away from everything and start over? Well, it's not that simple." "It is that simple," I replied, trying to stay calm. "You signed the divorce papers, Mason. This is done." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're better off without me? At your age? With a divorce on your record? No one's going to want you, Olivia." I felt a surge of anger rise up in me. "You're wrong," I said. "I've already moved on, Mason. I'm with someone else now." For a moment, Mason looked stunned. He blinked, as if trying to process what I had just said. Then, his expression shifted into something darker. "You're lying," he said, his voice low. "You're just trying to make me jealous." "I'm not lying," I said, standing my ground. "I'm happy, Mason. I've moved on." Mason's face twisted with rage. "You think you can just replace me? After everything we've been through?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're done, Mason. You need to accept that." For a moment, he just stood there, his face red with anger. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. After Mason's unexpected visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done causing trouble. But as the days turned into weeks, I heard nothing from him. It was as if he had finally given up. Noah was there for me through it all. He never pushed, never questioned my feelings. He just stood by my side, offering me the support I needed. One evening, as we sat together in the park, watching the sun set over the horizon, Noah turned to me and took my hand. "Olivia, I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know that I love you." His words took me by surprise, but as I looked into his eyes, I realized that I loved him too, more than I had ever loved anyone. "I love you too," I said, smiling through the tears that had begun to well up in my eyes. Noah pulled me into his arms, holding me close as the sun dipped below the horizon. In that moment, I knew that I had finally found the peace I had been searching for. Months later, Noah and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony. It wasn't the big, extravagant wedding I had once dreamed of, but it was perfect. Surrounded by the people we loved, we exchanged vows and promised to build a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. Mason, as far as I knew, had moved out of the city. I had heard from mutual friends that he was struggling to find work, that he had burned too many bridges in both his personal and professional life. I didn't feel sorry for him, though. He had made his choices, just as I had made mine. As I stood next to Noah, looking out at the future we would build together, I realized that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go of the past. But in doing so, you open yourself up to new possibilities, to a life filled with love, joy, and the happiness you truly deserve. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.